After teaching research methods and comparative politics at Princeton, Oxford, and now in Rome, I can tell you this. Students often struggle to write research papers because they do not have a good structure in place. So let's fix that today. Hello everyone, my name is Bogdan Popescu and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Cabot University, Rome. I also used to teach at Oxford and at Princeton, and I used to supervise both undergraduate and MA theses. In this video, we're going to look at the main structure of a good research paper. At the end of the video, I'll also show you a working template that you can use as a structure to guide writing the article. In principle, any research paper in any kind of field should have 7 important sections: introduction, literature review, theory and argument, methods, findings, discussion, and conclusion. But before you even start writing the paper, you have to have some sense of what is the topic that you're interested in studying. Of course, if you have a topic, doesn't necessarily mean that you have a research question already. The research question is somewhat distinct from a topic. A topic is a series of themes, of concepts, whereas a research question is something that's more specific. In order to come up with a research question, it's important to have some familiarity with the literature. So as I mentioned in the previous video that I invite you to check out, it is important to make the transition from a topic, which is what drives your curiosity, what motivates you, to something that looks more like a research question, which is more specific and driven from what has not already been done in the literature. So once you've done this preliminary step, you are now ready to move on to the next section or to the next part of the article writing process. Well, the first part of any article is the introduction, but in the first instance, given that you're starting to explore what you're trying to do research on, it's probably a good idea to start off with the literature review. So the literature review is essentially a synthesis of what other scholars have done in the field, and this will allow you to identify what is the potential gap, where it is that you feel you can contribute with your research. So before you do the literature review, it's important to look for relevant sources. Of course, Google Scholar is an important research resource here. I encourage you to check out peer-reviewed publications. So anything that sounds like journal of, those are much more relevant when you're writing a research paper as opposed to newspaper articles. The second important criterion that should be used when identifying sources is relevance. These peer-reviewed publications have to be relevant for the topic that you're interested in studying. You should download all these relevant or seemingly relevant articles, put them in a separate folder, and then start reading the main abstracts and potentially introductions. I encourage you to start off with 3 or 4 articles, read the abstracts carefully, and after you've done this, you can make a decision whether you want to read those articles in depth or not. If you feel like they're not relevant for your work, I encourage you to keep downloading sources until you have at least 3 or 4 relevant articles that will give you some sort of background for the topic that you're interested in. After you do that, then you should probably read the entire article carefully. All these 3 articles, you should read them carefully and take notes of what those articles are missing or what is the potential gap that you could be filling. So when you read the introduction to these articles, you should write on a piece of paper or on your tablet, what are the kinds of things that you might be disagreeing with, or what are the types of things that you're not as persuaded by. These will be guiding questions for identifying gaps in the literature. So the additional element that's going to be helpful when drafting a literature review is to identify themes and debates. So you'll see that there are certain strands of literature that speak about general topics. So these are kinds of patterns that you should be able to identify. You'll also notice once you identify some of these themes that some of them might be contradictory. So that's a really useful thing to do in a literature review, to identify things that seem to be in tension with one another. So this could be a very interesting, unique contribution when it comes to the literature by articulating the fact that you're actually bringing in conversations different scholarships. Then once you keep writing these ideas and these themes, you'll soon realize that you have potential structure that you can work with that could be guiding the way you write your literature review. Finally, after you've done all this reading and you've taken notes, you can actually start writing it. So some of the questions that typically guide me in writing the literature review would be one, what is the current literature missing? So you're not just summarizing the literature in the literature review, but you're actually articulating what the literature is potentially missing. You have to explain why what the literature is missing is important. It's important to articulate that the contribution that you're making is in fact important and that's changing the field in some important way. You should also articulate what are the consequences for this gap. Why is it urgent to actually identify this gap and work on it? And finally, why does this gap matter? So those would be the four important questions that you need to be able to answer when it comes to the literature review. Finally, the gap needs to be followed by an articulation of what the contribution of the article is, right? So here you have three important questions. One is, what does the reader not know and what they didn't know before? How are you changing their understanding about a specific problem? And then, how do you want them to think differently about the problem after reading your article? So these are the three important elements that will emphasize the contribution of the article and articulate why the article needs to be read by your audience. After you're done with the literature review, it's important to move to the theory and argument. Many research papers may not necessarily have these sections specifically titled theory and argument, but this is a section in which you define what is the main outcome that you're trying to explain and what is the main explanatory variable. So within the theory and argument section, it's important to define the main outcome of interest. So what is the main concept of the paper? How do you define it and how might have other people defined it? And if there's differences between the way you define it and other people's definition, it's important to explain why your definition is superior. The theory and argument should also emphasize the specific answer to the research question that's being posed in the introduction. So a typical theoretical framework should typically address questions like, what are the main explanatory variables that help explain the outcome of interest? How are those variables defined conceptually and operationally? What are your hypotheses? So hypotheses are simple statements that articulate the relationship between the main independent variables and the dependent variable. And then finally, are there any spatial and temporal dimensions of the study? So it's important to think about whether the logic that you're putting forward in your article, whether that's specific to a specific location, so to speak, so a specific geography, or whether that's applied globally. Similarly, it's important to reflect on the temporal dimension of your argument, whether this applies historically or this applies to a modern context. It's also important within the theory section to add a short diagram emphasizing what the main independent variable and the main dependent variable is. Although what the main independent and dependent variables are should be pretty clear from your prose, from the way you write your theoretical framework, it's always useful for the audience to read a simplified version of that in the form of a diagram. Essentially, a plot in which you emphasize here's the main independent variable or independent variables, and here's the main outcome of interest. It's always a good idea to present your argument in the stylized fashion. After you're done with your theory and argument, you can now move on to the methods section. So this is a part of the paper that emphasizes how you did your research. So some guiding questions for the methods section include, how did you do your research? What was the research design? I'm going to explain in a few seconds what that is. Was the main method qualitative, quantitative, or both? And what was the unit of analysis? Did you use countries as units of analysis? Did you use individuals? Did you use firms, companies as units of analysis? But then within the research design, so within the methods section, you should have a subsection called the research design, which is a methodological framework that should emphasize the answer to these questions. So what data are you using? Where did you get the data from? How novel is this data? Is this data something that has been used by other papers? Is this data publicly available? How are you analyzing the data? What kind of methodology are you using? How do the results from this methodology help answer the question? Are there any limitations behind utilizing the particular methodology in your case? What variables are analyzed? And then how did you choose those variables? So these are the 8 questions that are important to keep in mind when writing the methods section. The findings section is the 5th section in your article. This is the part that focusing on what the data shows. So it could be both descriptive or evidence-based. Some of the things you could include here are survey statistics or quotes from respondents of your interviews or observed patterns. So within this section, you can also utilize guiding questions such as, do the findings directly help answer the research question posed in the introduction? Are the findings relevant and thematically cohesive? And finally, you should also situate your findings within the bigger context. So how do your findings compare to other scholars in the field? The discussion section is the 6th item in your research paper. This is the section which articulates the so what. This is an obvious question that needs to be answered in any research paper. Like, this emphasizes essentially why your research is relevant, why it is important, and why should people care about it. So the 3 important questions that should be used as guidelines would be, why do the findings matter? What are the broader implications? And what are the potential limitations? So when we think about why do the findings matter, you should think about whether the findings contribute to what we already know from the literature. Does it challenge? Does it confirm existing studies? Does it reveal potentially previously overlooked relationships? When it comes to what are the broader implications, this really is about how scholars and how readers should be thinking differently about a particular topic, and what are the potential paths that your research is opening up for future research. When it comes to limitations, obviously, you should think about what are the potential questions that your article does not answer? How could future works address those limitations? The introduction and the conclusions are the final sections in your paper that you need to focus on. After you spend time working on the literature review, on the argument and theory, on the methodology, on findings, it is high time to actually write the introduction and conclusion. So these 2 sections should be written together because these are mirror images of one another. Both in the introduction and in the conclusion, you should answer questions like, what does your research demonstrate? What is the new message that your research delivers that wasn't known before? Why is this information or this knowledge necessary? And how does it benefit the discipline? Why does your finding matter? How are your findings important for a general audience? And then what are the potential questions that are left unanswered? So apart from the last question, which is what are the questions that are left unanswered, all the other answers to the other questions should be somehow present both in the introduction and in the conclusion. Okay, in order to help you out with writing the research paper and to sort of visualize these different section titles that we discussed, it's important to actually see them on paper. So in order to help you out, I produced this paper template that I always give to my students in order to guide their research process. So you find this as a link to the PDF. This is the starting page. Of course, you should start off with a title, a subtitle, your name, and then a short abstract. But then this is where you have the introduction section. So as I mentioned during the presentation, the introduction is really something that sets out the real world context for the paper and the motivation behind the project. This is where you need to articulate what does your research demonstrate, what does your research teach us that we didn't know already, but also why it's important to know this information. So remember, once again, the introduction is really something that comes to the very end of the research process. The literature review is probably, as I mentioned, the starting point of writing the paper. This is going to allow you to familiarize yourself with the literature, and this is the part in which you learn more. And this is where you also identify what the potential contribution to knowledge could be. So these are all the 6 questions that I mentioned during the presentation, and then the additional elements that help you articulate what is missing in the existing scholarship. The theory and argument is really a section that may not necessarily exist in other disciplines, but this is a part of the paper in which you fundamentally define what the main outcome and the main independent variable of interest is, in addition to explaining why the independent variable is causally connected to the dependent variable. This is where you could add a diagram like this. So as I mentioned, it's important to have some sort of visual representation of the main claim in the paper, so the main answer to the research question that you're posing. So the independent variable is affecting the dependent variable through some sort of mediating mechanism. The methods section is really the part of the paper that emphasizes how you conducted your analyses, what are the types of methods that you used, and what is the type of data that you analyzed. Then close to the very end, you have to discuss findings. So this is the part of the paper in which you explain how your findings directly answer the research question, why the findings are relevant, and how do you situate them within the existing literature. The discussion part emphasizes why the findings matter, what are the broader implications, and what are the limitations. And then the conclusion is, as I mentioned, a mirror image of the introduction, once again explaining what the research demonstrates, what is novel here, what are the new elements that we didn't know before, and why do people need this information. In addition, it's important to remind the reader why the findings matter and how are the findings important for a general audience. So hopefully you'll find some use for this template. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and drop a comment down below and let me know what are the academic topics you'd like me to cover, or let me know if you have any questions. See you very soon.